bells always rang first. Long before soldiers appeared on the hills, before banners rose beyond the forests, before smoke marked the arrival of armies, the bells would begin to ring. Inside the stone walls of monasteries across medieval Europe, those bells carried a meaning a few people outside the walls truly understood. It was not celebration. It was not the gentle call to prayer. It was a warning. Because when war came to a city, monasteries were never truly safe, and for the women who lived inside them, the danger did not always arrive with swords. Sometimes it arrived with silence, and sometimes it arrived with rules. In medieval society, monasteries and convents were believed to be protected places, sacred ground set apart from the violence of the outside world. Thick stone walls surrounded them, iron gates sealed their entrances, and centuries of tradition gave the illusion that nothing from the outside world could reach them. To ordinary townspeople, these places seemed untouched by the chaos that swallowed cities during war. But history tells a different story. When a siege began, armies surrounded entire cities and cut off supplies, communication, and escape routes. Roads vanished overnight. Markets closed. Wells ran low. A city under siege became a prison made of stone, and inside those prison walls were monasteries where women had dedicated their lives to prayer, quiet labor, and separation from the outside world. The moment a siege began, the convent gates were closed and sealed. At first it seemed like protection, but the sisters inside knew the truth. Those gates were not only meant to keep danger out, they were meant to keep everyone inside. Once the gates were sealed, no one left, no matter what happened beyond the walls. Every monastery had a rule book filled with traditions that had survived for centuries. But when war surrounded a city, another rule quietly appeared. A rule rarely written down, but understood by every sister who had lived through a siege. After sunset, there must be silence. Not the peaceful silence of prayer, but a listening silence. At night, strange sounds carried across the monastery halls and through the narrow stone corridors. Sometimes the sisters heard distant marching far beyond the city walls. Sometimes they heard metal striking metal like tools or armor being prepared somewhere in the dark. Sometimes voices traveled on the wind from outside the city, echoing strangely through the empty streets. And sometimes there was nothing at all, only the deep quiet that made every small sound feel important. The abbess, the woman who led the convent, always gave the same instructions. No lights near the windows after dark, no speaking above a whisper, and no sister was allowed to approach the outer walls of the monastery. The explanation was always the same. During a siege, curiosity could be dangerous. Watching the war too closely had consequences. But the war was not the only thing that arrived during a siege. Travelers appeared too. Refugees came from nearby villages carrying stories of burned homes and abandoned roads. Pilgrims who had been walking for weeks suddenly found themselves trapped inside city walls with nowhere to go. Sometimes mothers arrived carrying children who had not spoken a word since leaving their homes. Monasteries were often the only places that would open their doors to these people. Offering shelter was part of the sisters' duty, and at first the refugees were welcomed inside. But over time, the abbess began to notice strange patterns among the visitors. Some of the travelers asked unusual questions. They asked about the monastery gates and how often they were opened. They asked how many sisters lived inside the convent. They asked how high the walls were and whether the bell tower could see beyond the city gates. At first, the questions seemed harmless, the curiosity of frightened people searching for safety. But eventually, the abbess began quietly, recording the details of each visitor. Names, clothing, accents, the direction they had traveled from, because something strange kept happening. Many of the travelers stayed only one night before leaving again before sunrise, and sometimes weeks later, someone who looked very similar would appear again, wearing different clothes and telling a slightly different story. As the siege continued, another problem slowly appeared inside the convent walls. Supplies began to shrink faster than expected. Bread that should have lasted several days disappeared sooner than the kitchen records predicted. Water barrels emptied earlier than planned. Candles burned down faster than anyone remembered using them. The sisters carefully recorded every ration, yet the numbers stopped matching the records. Some believed the refugees were secretly taking extra food out of desperation. Others thought mistakes were being made in the kitchen during the chaos of siege life. The abbess refused to accuse anyone. At first, the rule seemed unnecessary, but she introduced a new rule. From that day forward, every sister would eat together at the same time. No meals alone in private chambers, and no carrying food into the dormitories. At first, the rule seemed unnecessary, but one night, a young novice reported hearing footsteps inside the pantry long after the kitchen doors had been locked for the evening. When the sisters opened the pantry the next morning, nothing seemed disturbed, yet several loaves of bread were gone. Like most ancient monasteries, the convent contained many unused spaces, narrow chambers that had once served different purposes centuries earlier. Some rooms stored old manuscripts. Others held broken furniture or tools no longer used. There was one room, however, that no one entered anymore, a small stone chamber near the outer wall. According to the monastery's oldest records, the room had once been used for isolation, a place where troubled sisters could spend time alone in reflection and silence. But, over the years, the door had simply stopped being used. It was not locked, and it was not sealed. It was simply ignored. The novices whispered stories about the room when the older sisters were not listening. Some claimed voices could be heard inside late at night. Others believed the chamber connected to hidden tunnels beneath the monastery that had existed long before the current buildings were constructed. The abbess dismissed the stories as imagination, yet during the siege, something unusual happened. 2 senior sisters were assigned to guard the hallway near the chamber every night. They were given simple instructions. No one was allowed to approach the door. No one was allowed to enter the room. And if anyone asked about it, they must say the chamber did not exist. Weeks passed, and the siege tightened around the city. Routine became survival. Prayers began before sunrise. Work filled the daylight hours. Silence returned after sunset. But gradually, the routine changed. The bells rang at different times. Evening prayers were moved earlier than usual. And finally, the abbess announced another rule that confused many of the sisters. No one was allowed to sleep alone. Every sister must share a chamber with another. The explanation was safety. But whispers spread through the dormitories because strange things had begun happening during the night. Candles that had been carefully placed beside beds were found extinguished in the morning. Doors that had been closed before sleep were discovered standing open. One novice insisted she woke in the middle of the night and saw someone standing beside her bed watching her. She believed it was another sister checking on her, but when she spoke, the figure walked silently away without answering. The next morning, the abbess reminded everyone that after evening prayers, no sister was allowed to wander the halls. No late visits to the chapel. No approaching the monastery gate. One evening, a messenger arrived outside the convent, walls carrying a sealed letter. Messengers were not unusual during sieges, but this one refused to enter the gate. Instead, he pushed the letter through a narrow opening in the wall and left immediately without explanation. The letter contained a warning that enemy forces had begun targeting monasteries across the region. Not for treasure and not for food, but for information. Monasteries kept records, maps, and sometimes letters sent between city leaders. The abbess read the message slowly and then burned it in a candle flame. That same night, she ordered the convent library locked. As the weeks dragged on, the sisters began noticing something even more unsettling beyond the monastery walls. Church bells from distant parts of the city began ringing in unusual patterns late at night. 3 rings followed by a pause, then 2 rings, then 1. The pattern repeated again and again across several nights. At first, no one understood the meaning, until one of the oldest sisters recognized the pattern from stories told long ago. The bells were being used to send signals, military signals. Someone inside the city was communicating with forces outside the walls using the church towers. The abbess gathered the sisters in the chapel and introduced another rule. From that moment forward, the monastery bells would remain silent. Not even prayer would ring them. Silence would replace their sound entirely. The sisters obeyed, yet several nights later, some of them claimed they could still hear bells ringing faintly through the corridors, even though the bell tower remained completely still. One night, something happened that none of the sisters could explain. A guard walking the outer hallway noticed the monastery gate had shifted open slightly, just enough for someone to slip through the narrow gap. The guard assumed someone had forgotten to secure the heavy lock earlier that evening, but when the abbess checked the records, every sister had already been accounted for. All present. All inside the walls, which meant someone had opened the gate without entering the convent. Weeks later, the abbess revealed a secret she had kept hidden since the siege began. There was another record inside the monastery, a hidden ledger passed down through generations of abbesses. The ledger recorded every siege the convent had ever survived, and the entries followed a disturbing pattern. Each siege began the same way. Strangers appeared seeking shelter. Strange questions were asked. Food began disappearing. Footsteps were heard in empty corridors. And eventually, someone inside the monastery unknowingly began helping the attackers outside the walls through small actions. A door left unlatched, a candle placed near a window, a gate slightly opened during the night, signals that someone outside could see. The abbess believed the same pattern was happening again, but this time she did not know who inside the monastery was responsible. The final rule arrived quietly. From that night forward, no sister was allowed to speak after sunset, not even whispers between beds. Because the previous night, several sisters had reported hearing voices echoing through the monastery halls, voices that sounded exactly like their own. The siege continued, and the days blurred together until the sisters began noticing something that frightened them even more than the armies outside the city walls. The rules were changing faster. New ones appeared almost every morning written on the chapel wall. Yet no one remembered who had written them. And the abbess, the woman who had created every rule since the siege began, had not left her chamber in 3 days. But each dawn, another rule appeared written in her handwriting.